We're coming to you today from the rain-slicked woods of the Pacific Northwest, where a soft, steady drizzle is currently drumming against the roof, wrapping the world in a quiet silver haze. It is the perfect atmosphere to settle in, turn the lights down low, and lose yourself in a story. And if you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to connect with you. Tonight, we are exploring 5 accounts that peel back the veneer of the everyday to reveal something far more unsettling. Our first story takes us back to 2013, to the heart of Los Angeles. We're going to a place called the Cecil Hotel, a building with a history so heavy with tragedy, it feels as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. The sun was beating down on the sprawling pavement of Los Angeles in early 2013, casting long, sharp shadows across the intersection of Main Street and 7th. For 21-year-old Elisa Lam, this city was just one stop on her West Coast tour, a solo adventure she had embarked on to clear her head and see the world outside of her home in Vancouver. She was a daughter, a student, and a prolific blogger who shared her thoughts with a small but dedicated community online. To those who knew her, she was bright, thoughtful, and perhaps a bit quiet, but she possessed a spark of curiosity that pushed her to travel nearly 1,000 miles from home. On January 26, 2013, Elisa walked through the heavy glass doors of the Cecil Hotel. At first glance, the lobby was a masterpiece of Art Deco design, shining brass, cold marble floors, and high ceilings that suggested a level of luxury from a bygone era. It felt like the perfect, affordable base for a young traveler on a budget. She checked into her room, likely unpacked her light luggage, and took a moment to breathe in the dry California air. Every single day, like clockwork, she called her parents back in Canada to tell them she was safe, describing the sights she'd seen and the people she'd encountered. To her family, everything seemed perfectly normal. It was just a young woman finding her way in a new city. But while the lobby of the Cecil Hotel wore a mask of faded grandeur, the building itself had a much darker reputation within the local community. To the people who lived in the surrounding Skid Row district, the Cecil wasn't just a hotel. It was a landmark of tragedy. Over the decades, it had been the site of countless unnatural deaths, and it had even served as a temporary home for some of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The staff and the locals knew that the hallways held a certain heaviness, an atmosphere that seemed to cling to the wallpaper like smoke. While Elisa saw a budget-friendly hostel, the predator in the story, the building itself was hiding a century of ghosts behind its brass elevators and locked fire doors. On January 31st, Elisa was supposed to check out of her room and head to Santa Cruz, her next destination. She had been seen earlier that day by a local bookstore owner who described her as outgoing and lively. There were no red flags, no signs of distress. But when that evening came, the daily phone call to her parents never happened. The silence was immediate and terrifying. For the first time in her trip, the connection was severed, and as the night fell over the flickering neon lights of downtown Los Angeles, Elisa Lam simply vanished into the shadows of a hotel that had a habit of making people disappear. The turning point didn't happen with a loud bang or a cry for help. It happened in the flickering, low-resolution silence of a security camera. On February 1st, 2013, the daily rhythm of the hotel was broken by the arrival of the Los Angeles Police Department. Elisa's parents had sounded the alarm, and suddenly, the faded hallways of the Cecil were crawling with officers and search dogs. The initial chaos was a quiet, heavy dread that seeped into the building like the light rain that began to mist the city streets outside. The investigators retreated to a small, cramped security room to review the tapes, and what they saw would eventually haunt the entire world. In the footage from the elevator, Elisa walks into the frame wearing a red hoodie, appearing at first like any other guest. But then, she leans forward and presses a vertical row of buttons, one after another, yet the heavy metal doors refuse to slide shut. What follows is 4 minutes of pure, unadulterated tension. Elisa steps to the edge of the elevator, peering into the hallway with a sudden, jerky motion. She looks left, then right, and then she lunges back into the corner of the elevator, pressing her back against the wall as if she is trying to disappear into the very metal itself. Outside in the city, the sound of the rain was muffled by the thick walls of the hotel, but inside that elevator, the silence was deafening. She steps out again, and this is where the footage turns truly bizarre. She begins to move her hands in fluid, waving motions, her fingers splayed and twisting, as if she is conducting a conversation with someone standing just out of sight. There is no one there. Her body contorts, her feet dancing a strange, erratic rhythm on the carpet, and then she simply walks out of the frame. disappearing into the darkness of the 14th floor. For the next 19 days, the Cecil Hotel continued to operate as if nothing was wrong. While police dogs sniffed at the rooftop and officers knocked on doors, the guests began to report something deeply unsettling. They would turn on their faucets to brush their teeth, and the water would come out in a dark brownish trickle. When they showered, the water felt slick and smelled of something sickly, sweet, and metallic. The chaos wasn't a single scream. It was the slow, horrifying realization spreading through the guest list that something was very wrong with the lifeblood of the building. The Cecil Hotel was not merely a building. It was a predator that had been lying in wait for nearly a century, slowly weaving a web of tragedy that seemed to draw in the lost and the vulnerable. To understand the preparation that went into this tragedy, you have to look at the rooftop, a place that was never meant for the living. It was a cold, industrial landscape of gravel, pipes, and 4 massive cylindrical water tanks that loomed over the edge of the building like silent iron giants. The dark side of this environment was its total isolation, despite being in the heart of one of the busiest cities in the world. Each of those tanks stood over 8 feet tall and held a staggering amount of water meant to supply the hundreds of rooms below. The psychology of the space was one of forbidden access. The roof was protected by a heavy fire door that was supposed to be a hard barrier. It was equipped with an alarm so loud it could be heard throughout the top floors, a system designed specifically to keep people from wandering into the dangerous machinery above. But the predator, whether it was a person, a mental shadow, or the building itself, seemed to know the cracks in the armor. On that night in early 2013, the alarm system remained eerily silent. No sirens wailed, and no security guards were alerted. The preparation for Elisa's final moments involved a series of nearly impossible physical hurdles. To reach the top of those tanks, she would have had to scale a sheer metal surface with no fixed ladder. She would have had to find a way to navigate the pitch-black roof, perhaps using only the distant, flickering lights of the Los Angeles skyline for guidance. Then there was the lid. Each tank was capped with a heavy metal hatch. To lift it while balancing on the edge of an 8-foot drop would require significant upper body strength and a terrifying level of resolve. But the most bone-chilling detail, the one that points to a meticulous and dark conclusion, is that when the maintenance worker finally climbed up there 19 days later, he found the lid closed. This suggests a predatory logic that is hard to wrap the mind around. If Elisa had climbed in herself during a state of erratic distress, the kind seen in the elevator footage, how did she manage to pull that heavy steel lid shut from the inside while treading water in the dark? The secret basement of this story wasn't underground. It was at the very top of the world, a soundproof tomb where the screams of a young woman would be drowned out by the hum of the city and the churning of the pipes, hidden away in a tank that would slowly, methodically, begin to poison the very people sleeping just a few floors below. The investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department quickly hit a wall of cold, unyielding concrete. As the days stretched into a week, then 2, the search efforts seemed to stall despite the mounting pressure from the public and Elisa's distraught family. The police had conducted a floor-by-floor sweep of the 19-story building. They had brought in the canine units, their paws clicking on the marble floors of the lobby and their noses twitching in the stagnant air of the basement. They even made it to the roof, but the search failed due to a series of minor, yet catastrophic oversights. The psychological barrier of the Cecil Hotel played a massive role in this deadlock. Situated on the edge of Skid Row, the hotel was a fortress of isolation in the middle of a teeming metropolis. The staff and the long-term residents were used to the eccentricities of the transient population. They were conditioned to ignore the muffled sounds behind thin walls or the sight of someone acting strangely in the hallways. This community silence, born from decades of survival in a rough neighborhood, meant that very few people were willing or able to provide a lead. To the world outside, Elisa was a missing person. To the Cecil, she was just another shadow that had stopped moving. The police were also misled by the hotel's own security measures. Because the roof door was alarmed and supposedly required a key, the investigators didn't prioritize a deep dive into the industrial equipment at the very top of the building. They looked around the tanks, but they didn't look inside them. It was a minor error in judgment, a failure to account for the sheer unpredictability of a person in the midst of a crisis that resulted in 19 days of silence. While the authorities shifted their focus to the streets of Los Angeles, looking for a predator in a human mask, the true horror was literally right above their heads. The deadlock wasn't broken by a brilliant piece of detective work or a sudden confession. It was broken by the physical reality of what was happening inside those tanks. The community at the Cecil only began to speak up when the tragedy became something they could no longer ignore, not because of a conscience, but because of the color and the sickening, metallic taste of the water they were using every single day. The discovery was not the result of a brilliant forensic breakthrough or a sudden tip to a hotline. Instead, the truth surfaced because of a series of complaints that had been growing louder in the hallways for days. It was a random fluke, a physical reality that the hotel could no longer mask with its grand lobby and history of silence. Guests on the upper floors began to notice that when they turned on their faucets to wash their faces in the morning, the water didn't run clear. It was tinged with a faint yellowish-brown hue, and it had a viscosity that felt wrong against the skin. By the morning of February 19, 2013, the complaints had turned into a chorus of disgust. One guest described the water as being black when first turned on, and having a funny taste, a metallic, sickly sweetness that stayed on the tongue long after the water was gone. The hotel management, finally pushed to action by the failing plumbing, sent a maintenance worker to the roof to investigate the supply tanks. The climb was steep and isolated. As the worker ascended the metal ladder to the top of the largest tank, he was hundreds of feet above the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles, yet he was completely alone. The air was thin and smelled of sun-baked gravel and city smog. He reached the top of the 8-foot-tall cylinder and gripped the handle of the heavy metal hatch. With a heave, he swung the lid open, and a wave of cool, damp air escaped from the dark interior. The water inside was deep and still, reflecting nothing but the square of light from the open hatch. But as his vision settled, the maintenance worker realized he wasn't looking at a mechanical failure. Floating in the middle of the tank, bobbing gently in the water that the guests had been using to drink and bathe for nearly 20 days, was a human figure. It was Elisa Lam. The extreme tension of the mystery had finally broken, replaced by a visceral, bone-deep horror. The girl who had been seen acting so strangely in the elevator footage had been found, but the discovery only raised more terrifying questions about how she had gotten inside a sealed tank on a locked roof. The aftermath of the discovery was a storm of camera flashes and heavy-hearted questions that flooded the streets of Los Angeles in 2013. The Cecil Hotel, once a place of anonymity for travelers, became the center of a global obsession. In the end, the coroner's report provided an answer that many found difficult to swallow. They ruled the death of 21-year-old Elisa Lam as an accidental drowning. The report noted her struggle with bipolar disorder, leading to the controversial official conclusion that a compelling natural force was responsible for the tragedy. To the public, however, the conclusion felt like a hollow echoes in a vast, empty room. Internet sleuths spent thousands of hours dissecting every frame of that grainy elevator footage, looking for a shadow or a person who wasn't there, trying to make sense of her erratic behavior. There was no trial, no villain led away in handcuffs, and no grand moment of justice. There was only the quiet, crushing weight of futility for a family back in Vancouver who had lost their daughter to a series of events that defied simple explanation. The hotel remained standing, its brass fixtures still gleaming under the harsh California sun, but the air inside was forever changed. The water tanks were scrubbed, the pipes were cleared, and the guests eventually returned. But for those who were there during those 19 days, the memory of that dark metallic taste in the water would never truly leave them. It was a chilling reminder that the world is full of places where the shadows are just a little bit longer, and where the line between reality and the unknown is as thin as a sheet of glass. The tragedy at the Cecil was a mystery of the mind and the environment, but our next story takes us into the path of a predator who didn't hide in the shadows of a building. Instead, he hid in plain sight, using a mask of charm and intellect to walk among us completely undetected. The early 1970s in the United States felt like a world draped in a golden, hazy sun. On university campuses across the Pacific Northwest, the air was often thick with the scent of damp pine needles and the distant, rhythmic thrum of acoustic guitars. It was an era defined by a sense of invincibility. Young women moved through these spaces with a level of trust that is almost impossible to fathom today. They walked across leaf-strewn quads in the fading twilight, their bell-bottom jeans brushing against the pavement, their minds occupied by the small, mundane details of a life just beginning. They believed that a smile from a stranger was simply a sign of a friendly neighbor, and they lived in a world where safety wasn't a conscious choice, but a given state of being. This was the illusion of normalcy, a peaceful, rhythmic existence where the greatest fear was a late-night study session or a missed connection at a coffee shop. But moving through this vibrant, youthful landscape was a man who didn't look like a monster. In fact, he looked exactly like the kind of man you would want to know. He was handsome, possessing a sharp, symmetrical face and a gaze that felt both intelligent and warm. He was articulate, capable of navigating complex legal theories or political strategies with an ease that commanded respect in any room he entered. To those in his community, he was a rising star, a dedicated law student, and a political volunteer with a future that seemed to stretch out toward the horizon like a sunrise. This was the mask of Ted Bundy. He didn't hide in the deep shadows of an alleyway. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, perfectly illuminated by the street lamps. He understood that the best way to catch a person off guard was to appear as though he was the one who needed help. He would often be seen limping across a crowded parking lot, a heavy white plaster cast wrapped around his arm, or perhaps leaning heavily on a pair of wooden crutches. He would struggle with a stack of books or a bag of groceries, looking every bit the part of a vulnerable, injured student who was simply trying to get by. When he would stop a young woman and ask, with a charming, slightly embarrassed smile, if she could spare a few seconds to help him load his car, it never felt like a threat. It felt like a chance to do a good deed for someone who was clearly struggling. He used his intellect and his charismatic appearance to build a bridge of trust in a matter of seconds, turning a total stranger into a willing helper. But that bridge was a trap. Beneath the well-pressed clothes and the educated vocabulary sat a predator who had meticulously studied the rhythms of the community, waiting for the perfect moment to let the mask slip and reveal the darkness underneath. The shift from a mundane, peaceful evening to a living nightmare happened in the blink of an eye. Imagine a quiet, dimly lit parking lot on a college campus in the mid-1970s. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, rhythmic hum of a city settling in for the night. A young woman walks toward her car, her keys jingling in her hand, her mind already miles away, thinking about her plans for the weekend. Then she sees him, the man with the charming, symmetrical face and the bright white plaster cast wrapped around his arm. He looks up as she approaches, his brow furrowed in a display of polite, understated frustration as he fumbles with a heavy brown box near the open door of his tan Volkswagen Beetle. "I am so sorry to bother you," he says, his voice smooth and refined, the tone of a man who spent his days in law libraries. "But would you mind giving me a hand with this? This cast is making everything 10 times harder than it needs to be. It is a request that feels entirely safe. A small act of neighborly kindness in a world that still believed in the inherent goodness of a handsome stranger." She walks over, setting her own bags down on the cold asphalt to help. But as she leans into the dark, cramped interior of the car to set the box down, the atmosphere shifts with a terrifying, silent speed. The split second occurs when she is most vulnerable. The handsome mask of the law student evaporates, replaced by a cold, hollow intensity. There is a sudden, sharp movement, the sound of a heavy object striking bone, and the world simply goes dark. The initial chaos of the 1970s was not a loud commotion. It was a chilling, hollow absence. In an era before cell phones and GPS tracking, a disappearance was a slow-burning fuse. When the young woman didn't return to her dorm that night, her roommates initially thought she had simply stayed late at the library or decided to stay with a friend. It wasn't until the following morning, when her bed remained unmade and her books sat untouched, that the first ripples of panic began to spread through the halls. There were no reports of muffled screams or a struggle, only the memory of a tan car fading into the distance, and the sudden, terrifying realization that another one of their own had vanished into the shadows of the 1970s. The true horror of the man known as the charismatic killer wasn't found in a dark alleyway or a boarded-up basement, but in the meticulous, cold-blooded preparation he put into his work, while the rest of the world saw a dedicated law student. To understand the dark side of this predator, you have to look past the tailored suits and the winning smile and step inside the one place where his mask truly came off: his tan 1968 Volkswagen Beetle. To any passerby, it was just a common, somewhat cramped economy car. But for the predator, it was a mobile chamber designed for a singular, grim purpose. He had spent hours in the quiet of his own driveway, methodically modifying the vehicle. He didn't just keep it clean, he re-engineered the interior. He took the unusual step of completely removing the front passenger seat. To someone looking through the window, it might have looked like he was just moving furniture, but the reality was far more sinister. By removing that seat, he created a flat, open space on the floor of the car, a space where a person could be laid down, out of sight of any other drivers on the road. It was a secret basement on wheels, hidden in plain sight. Inside that car, tucked away in the glove box or beneath the floor mats, was his kit. This wasn't the disorganized mess of a common criminal. It was a curated collection of tools for a man who viewed himself as a craftsman of death. He carried handcuffs, a crowbar, lengths of sturdy rope, and thick rolls of tape. He even kept a second mask, not a psychological one, but a physical one, to ensure that if he were ever spotted by a fleeting witness, his true face would remain a mystery. But his most effective tool of preparation was his own intellect. He didn't just choose victims at random, he scouted locations and studied the rhythms of his environment. He would spend hours sitting in his car near libraries or dormitories, watching the flow of students, looking for the one person who appeared slightly more distracted or helpful than the rest. His cast, that heavy, white plaster shell he wore on his arm, was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He knew that by faking a physical vulnerability, he was effectively soundproofing his intentions. People don't scream when they're helping a man with a broken arm. They lean in closer. They lower their guard. They step into his personal space, unaware that they are walking into a trap that had been laid days or even weeks in advance. His psychology was that of a high-functioning sociopath who lived in a state of constant, quiet observation. While he was sitting in his law classes, appearing to take notes on the finer points of the American legal system, his mind was likely miles away, deep in the rugged mountain ranges or the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. He didn't just kill, he collected locations. He found remote spots where the ground was soft and the trees were thick, places where he knew he could return to the remains of his victims without being disturbed. This meticulousness, this ability to live a double life where one half was a promising young professional and the other was a calculating monster, is what made him so uniquely terrifying. He didn't just wear a mask, he built an entire world behind it. The 1970s were a time of fragmented shadows and borders that felt like brick walls. As the disappearances began to stack up across the United States, the police found themselves caught in a terrifying deadlock. In wood-paneled precinct offices from Washington to Utah, detectives sat beneath flickering fluorescent lights, their desks buried under mountains of manila folders and grainy black and white photographs of missing young women. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and heavy tobacco smoke, a physical manifestation of the frustration that was settling into the bones of every investigator on the case. The search efforts were failing, not because of a lack of determination, but because of a series of minor systemic errors and the terrifyingly normal mask the predator wore. In 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, witnesses had actually seen a handsome man with his arm in a sling, a man who called himself Ted, approaching women and asking for help with his boat. They had a name, they had a description, they even had a make and model for his car. But in an era before centralized digital databases, having a name like Ted was like looking for a single grain of sand on a vast, windswept beach. The police were drowning in tips. Because this individual used his intellect and charm to blend into the highest levels of society, nobody wanted to believe that the polite law student next door could be a monster. When his name was eventually turned in by people who knew him, including a close friend and a girlfriend who had grown suspicious of his late-night absences, the investigators often pushed the files to the bottom of the pry stack. He didn't fit the profile of a bedraggled, lurking killer. He was a man who worked on political campaigns and sat in front-row seats at university lectures. This social bias created a psychological barrier that allowed the predator to remain invisible in plain sight. Furthermore, the lack of communication between state lines acted as a natural soundproofing for his crimes. When he moved from Washington to Utah and then to Colorado, the trail went cold in every jurisdiction he left behind. Information didn't travel at the speed of a fiber optic cable, it traveled at the speed of a postage stamp. By the time a detective in one state realized they were looking for the same man as a detective 3 states over, the predator had already changed his appearance, switched his license plates, and found a new hunting ground. The deadlock was a suffocating reality. The community remained largely silent because they were terrified, yet they didn't know what to look for. They were looking for a boogeyman in the bushes, not the charismatic young man offering to help them carry their groceries. The police were left staring at maps pinned with colored needles, each one representing a life vanished, unable to bridge the gap between the charming face of the law student and the dark reality of the charismatic killer. It was a stalemate of the most haunting kind, where the predator's greatest weapon wasn't his strength, but the simple, tragic fact that he looked just like everyone else. The air in the courtroom in Aspen, Colorado, was thick and stagnant in June of 1977. Ted Bundy, the man the world was beginning to recognize as a monster, sat at the defense table, but he wasn't sitting there like a prisoner. Because of his intellect and his background in law, he had been granted the right to represent himself in court. He didn't wear shackles, he wore a sharp, well-pressed suit. He didn't have a guard pressing a hand into his shoulder. He had the freedom to move about the room, shuffling papers and addressing the judge with a polished, respectful tone. This was a moment of extreme tension, a high-stakes gamble where the predator was using the very system he had violated to facilitate his exit. During a recess, he requested access to the courthouse's law library on the second floor to conduct research for his case. The guards, perhaps lulled into a sense of security by his polite demeanor and his civilized appearance, allowed him to enter the room alone. They stood outside the heavy wooden doors, waiting for the intellectual to finish his work. But inside, the predator wasn't looking at books. He was looking at a window. In a sudden, desperate moment of calculated madness, he opened the window and leaped. He fell 2 stories, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud, and then he simply ran. He vanished into the rugged, mountainous terrain of Aspen, leaving the authorities standing outside a library full of silent books and empty chairs. He was caught 6 days later, bedraggled and starving, but the negligence of the system would provide him with one more opening. On December 30th, 1977, while sitting in a jail cell in Glenwood Springs, he exploited a flaw in the building's structure. He had noticed a small, square opening in the ceiling for a light fixture. Over several weeks, he had methodically prepared for this moment, using a smuggled hacksaw blade to cut through the steel. He had shed over 20 pounds, starving himself until his frame was skeletal, just so he could fit through that narrow gap. On that cold December night, he climbed into the crawl space, navigated the dark, dusty skeletal remains of the building, and emerged into the warden's apartment while the warden and his wife were out for dinner. He walked out the front door, stole a car, and disappeared into the night for the second time. The final turning point wasn't a grand tactical maneuver by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a random fluke in Pensacola, Florida, in February of 1978. A local police officer was on a routine patrol when he spotted a stolen car driving erratically. He didn't know he was looking at the most wanted man in the country, he just saw a suspicious driver. When he pulled the vehicle over, the predator didn't go quietly. There was a frantic struggle on the side of the dark road, a moment of pure, raw chaos amidst the quiet Florida night. It was only after he was tackled to the ground and his fingerprints were processed that the world realized the charismatic killer had finally run out of luck. The final chapter of The Man Who Had Worn 1,000 Masks did not end with a clever escape or a brilliant legal maneuver. Instead, it ended in the cold, unyielding silence of a death chamber in the Florida State Prison. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, the sun rose over the flat, humid landscape of Stark, Florida. But for Ted Bundy, the world was narrowing down to a single room and a heavy oak chair. Outside the prison gates, a strange and macabre atmosphere had taken hold. Hundreds of people had gathered, not in mourning, but in a state of grim celebration. They held up signs, they cheered, and some even wore hats shaped like electric chairs. The charismatic killer, who had once used his intellect to charm his way into the hearts of his community and the trust of his victims, had finally become a figure of pure, unfiltered loathing. The handsome law student who had once navigated the halls of power and represented himself in court with such arrogance was now just a man in an orange jumpsuit, his head shaved and his bravado finally extinguished. Inside the chamber, the air was thick and sterile. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the soft shuffling of the guard's feet on the concrete floor. As the heavy leather straps were tightened around his wrists and ankles, the reality of his 2 previous escapes felt like a distant, impossible dream. There would be no window to jump from this time, no crawl space to disappear into. The justice that had been delayed by his meticulous preparation and his predator's mask was finally catching up to him in the form of 2,000 volts of electricity. When the switch was finally thrown at 7:16 in the morning, a collective breath was released across the country. The man who had spent the 1970s terrorizing the United States, using a fake injury and a handsome face to lure young women to their deaths, was gone. But the aftermath of his crimes left a permanent scar on the American psyche. The lesson learned was a bitter one, that a predator doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes he looks like the man you'd want to marry, or the law student you'd want to help with his groceries. The families of the victims were left to pick up the pieces of lives that had been shattered in a split second of misplaced trust. For them, there was no true closure. only the quiet, heavy knowledge that the shadow which had haunted their lives for nearly 2 decades had finally been burned away. The charismatic killer became a cautionary tale, a reminder that behind every charming smile and every articulated argument, there can exist a darkness so profound it defies human understanding. But while some monsters hide behind a handsome face in a crowded city, others thrive in the absolute silence of the wilderness. Our next story takes us far away from the bustling streets of America to a remote, windswept farm in Bavaria, 1922. It is a place where the snow holds on to secrets, and where a family would discover that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the stranger you meet on the road, it's the one who is already inside your house. In the late winter of 1922, the Bavarian countryside was a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty. Rolling hills were buried under thick, suffocating blankets of snow, and the air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass. Tucked away in a small, isolated clearing about an hour's walk from the village of Kaifek sat a farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It was a lonely place, shielded from the rest of the world by a dense perimeter of dark, ancient woods that seemed to lean in toward the buildings, as if they were trying to reclaim the land. Life on the farm followed a rigid, centuries-old rhythm of labor. The family who lived there, the Grubers and the Gabriels, were known to be hardworking, though intensely private, bordering on reclusive. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man in his 60s who possessed a stern, weathered face and a reputation for being difficult. His wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, rounded out the household. To an outsider passing by on the distant road, Hinterkaifeck appeared to be the picture of rural stability. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the lowing of cattle echoed from the barn, and the family went about their chores with a quiet, practiced efficiency. This was their illusion of normalcy, a life defined by the boundaries of their fences and the warmth of their hearth. But in the days leading up to the end of March, the mask of the predator began to manifest not as a face, but as a series of unsettling anomalies that Andreas couldn't explain. It started with the snow. One morning, while surveying the perimeter of the property, Andreas discovered a set of footprints emerging from the edge of the dark forest. The prints were deep and clear, leading directly toward the farmhouse. He followed them with his eyes, expecting to see where the stranger had turned around and headed back into the trees. But as he traced the path, his blood went cold. There were footprints leading toward the house, but there were absolutely none leading away. The predator wasn't a man in a mask. It was a ghost in the machine of their daily lives. Andreas told his neighbors about these strange prints and about a newspaper he had found on the porch, a paper from the city that no one in the family had purchased. Then, the keys to the house vanished. In the quiet hours of the night, the family began to hear heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoing from the attic, directly above their bedrooms. Andreas had even searched the house with a lantern, checking every corner of the barn and the tool shed, but he found nothing. He assumed someone was hiding in the shadows, watching them, but the mask was the absolute silence that followed every search. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. She had been hired to replace the previous maid, who had fled the property months earlier, claiming the house was haunted by an invisible presence. As Maria stepped through the threshold, the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the courtyard. She had no way of knowing that the predator was already there, tucked away in the rafters or behind the heavy wooden doors, meticulously observing the family as they prepared for their final evening of normalcy. The stage was set, and the woods stood silent, waiting for the sun to disappear entirely. The sun had fully retreated behind the jagged black spikes of the forest, leaving Hinterkaifeck in a world of deepening blue and gray. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the lingering scent of a modest supper. But the peace was an illusion. The sudden incident didn't begin with a scream that tore through the night. It began with a series of quiet, beckoning sounds drifting from the heavy timber doors of the barn. One by one, the family members were drawn out of the warmth of their home and into the cold, shadow-drenched interior of the stable. It started with 63-year-old Andreas. Perhaps he heard a strange rustle in the hay or the agitated lowing of his cattle. He stepped out into the courtyard, his boots crunching on the freezing crust of the snow, and disappeared into the darkness of the barn. He never returned. Next came his wife, Cecilia, followed by their daughter, Victoria, and finally, 7-year-old Cecilia. The initial chaos was a muffled, rhythmic nightmare occurring in the pitch black. Each victim was met with the same sudden, violent end the moment they crossed the threshold. The predator stood in the rafters or behind the heavy wooden stalls, waiting for the split second they were most vulnerable. The weapon used was a mattock, a heavy, pickaxe-like tool designed for breaking hard soil, and it was wielded with a terrifying clinical force. There were no long struggles, only the sound of heavy iron meeting bone, followed by the soft thud of a body hitting the straw. Back inside the house, the new maid, Maria, was likely unpacking her meager belongings, unaware that the family she had just joined was being systematically erased only a few yards away. The 2-year-old, Josef, lay asleep in his cot, protected by nothing but the thin wooden slats of his bed and the deepening silence of the Bavarian night. The horror was absolute in its efficiency. In less than an hour, 6 lives were snuffed out, and the only sound remaining was the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls and the steady, indifferent breathing of the livestock. The dark side of this predator wasn't merely found in the cold iron of the mattock used to end the lives of the 6 victims. It was found in the terrifying, cold-blooded patience they exhibited in the days leading up to the massacre. To understand the psychology of the killer at Hinterkaifeck, you have to look at the farmhouse not as a home, but as a blind, a place where a hunter waits perfectly still for their prey to walk into the light. This individual didn't just stumble upon the farm. They conducted a period of meticulous preparation that would chill even the most seasoned investigator. The secret basement in this story was actually the attic and the hidden crawl spaces of the barn. For days, perhaps even weeks, the killer had been a silent roommate to the Gruber family. While Andreas, Kazelia, and Victoria went about their daily chores, a pair of eyes was likely watching them through the gaps in the wooden floorboards or from the pitch-black shadows of the hayloft. This predator had effectively soundproofed their presence by learning the rhythms of the house, knowing exactly which floorboards creaked and which doors were left unlocked at night. The psychological profile of this individual is one of extreme voyeurism and control. Most intruders want to get in and get out, but this person wanted to belong. They wanted to inhabit the family's life before they took it. Think about the footprints Andreas found in the snow. Those tracks, leading from the dark Bavarian woods directly to the house with no path leading away, were a physical manifestation of a predator who had decided that Hinterkaifeck was now their domain. They were already inside the perimeter, watching the family sleep, listening to their muffled conversations, and perhaps even sitting at their table in the middle of the night while the house was silent. But the most haunting evidence of the killer's dark psychology is what happened in the days following the crime. Instead of fleeing into the winter night to put distance between themselves and the 6 bodies, the killer chose to stay. They lived in the farmhouse for several days after the murders, moving through the rooms where the family's belongings still sat untouched. They were seen by neighbors as smoke continued to curl from the chimney, a sign of a normal household that was anything but. The predator ate the family's food, prepared meals in their kitchen, and slept in their beds while the victims lay nearby in the cold shadows of the barn. Perhaps most disturbingly, they even took the time to care for the livestock. They ensured the cattle were fed and the cows were milked, maintaining the illusion of a functioning farm while the true inhabitants were gone. This wasn't just a killer. It was someone who stepped into the vacuum of the lives they had just extinguished, finding a twisted sense of peace in the absolute silence they had created. The investigation into the horrors at Hinterkaifeck didn't begin with a frantic. In the spring of 1922, news in the Bavarian highlands traveled at the speed of a walking horse, and silence was often mistaken for peace. The police deadlock was a direct result of the psychological barriers that the Gruber family had built around themselves over decades. They were a family of shadows, reclusive, stern, and deeply unpopular in the nearby village of Kaifeck. Because of this, when the smoke continued to curl from the farmhouse chimney and the cattle were heard lowing in the barn, no one thought to check on them. The community's silence was the first major obstacle. The neighbors noticed small things, the mail was piling up in the box, and 7-year-old Cecilia hadn't appeared at school for days. Yet, the social barrier was so thick that people simply assumed the grumpy old Andreas Gruber was just having another one of his episodes of isolation. For 4 days, from April 1st to April 4th, the killer was effectively shielded by the village's hesitation to intrude. The search efforts finally began on the afternoon of April 4th, but they were doomed by a series of minor errors that turned into a forensic catastrophe. When a group of neighbors finally summoned the courage to walk onto the property, they didn't call the authorities first. Instead, they entered the barn themselves. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stumbled upon the bodies of the family, which had been covered in hay and old doors. In their shock and grief, these well-meaning villagers trampled over the entire crime scene. They moved the bodies, they touched the walls, and they sat at the kitchen table where the killer had eaten only hours or days before. By the time the professional investigators arrived from Munich, a journey that took hours across difficult terrain, the trail was not just cold, it had been virtually erased. The random fluke that could have caught the killer, like a fingerprint on a glass or a specific boot print in the mud, was lost in the chaos of the discovery. The police found themselves in a state of absolute deadlock. They had 6 victims and a weapon, the blood-stained mattock, but they had no suspects who fit the profile of someone who could murder a family and then move in with their ghosts for half a week. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck, once the family's sanctuary, had become the killer's greatest ally, turning a remote farm into a permanent mystery. The turning point finally arrived on April 4th, 1922, but it didn't come with the sound of a police siren or a frantic cry for help. It came in the form of a heavy, uneasy silence that had become impossible for the surrounding community to ignore any longer. For days, the mail had sat untouched in the box at the edge of the property, and the local schoolteacher had noted that 7-year-old Cecilia had been absent from her desk without a word of explanation. But it was the mechanical silence that finally broke the spell. A repairman had been scheduled to fix a stationary engine on the farm, and after working for hours on the property without seeing a single soul, he returned to the village and mentioned the eerie isolation of the Gruber homestead. Driven by a mixture of neighborly concern and a growing sense of dread, 3 men from the village, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Jakob Sigel, and Michael Pull, decided to walk out to the clearing where Hinterkaifeck sat nestled against the dark Bavarian woods. The air was cold, and the snow was beginning to turn to a gray, slushy mess under their boots. As they approached the farmhouse, the first thing they noticed was the absolute stillness. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no dogs barking, and no sound of footsteps from within. The extreme tension of the moment reached a breaking point when they reached the barn. They pushed open the heavy timber doors. The rusted hinges let out a long, low groan that seemed to echo through the empty courtyard. Inside, the barn was swallowed in shadow, smelling of stale hay and the metallic tang of old blood. As they moved further into the darkness, they stumbled upon a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Stacked one on top of the other, partially covered by hay and old discarded wooden doors, were the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and young Cecilia. They had all been brutally murdered with a heavy iron mattock, their lives extinguished in the very place they had come to investigate a strange noise. But the true turning point, the discovery that chilled the investigators to their core, wasn't just the presence of the bodies. It was the random fluke of evidence left behind in the house. When they finally summoned the courage to enter the living quarters, they expected to find a cold, abandoned tomb. Instead, they found a house that looked as though the inhabitants had only just stepped out for a moment. The stove was still warm to the touch. There were half-eaten meals sitting on the kitchen table, and the beds showed signs of having been slept in recently. The most horrifying realization was the state of the livestock. The cows had been meticulously milked, and the pigs had been fed. This was the moment of negligence that revealed the predator's true nature. The killer hadn't fled the scene of the crime. They had lived among the dead for 4 full days, inhabiting the home of the people they had just slaughtered, moving through the shadows of Hinterkaifeck like a ghost that refused to leave. The heavy iron of the mattock had done its grim work, but the mystery it left behind was even sharper and more enduring than the blade itself. In the months and years following that cold April day in 1922, the investigation into the tragedy at Hinterkaifeck became a journey into a psychological void. The Bavarian authorities were left to piece together a puzzle where the most crucial pieces had been intentionally burned or buried in the silence of the farmstead. The fate of those involved was a tragedy defined by absolute, chilling finality. 6 members of the household, the patriarch, the grandmother, the daughter, 2 innocent children, and a maid who had not even finished her first day of work, were erased from the world in a single afternoon. But the true horror, the lesson that would haunt the community for over a century, was the knowledge of the predator's endurance. The fact that an individual could inhabit the space of the dead, eating their bread and tending to their lowing cattle while their bodies lay only a few yards away, suggested a level of depravity that the local villagers could not wrap their minds around. Justice, in this case, proved to be an elusive ghost. Despite the thousands of pages of testimony and the haunting evidence of those footprints in the snow that only led toward the house, no one was ever brought to account for the massacre. The case remains a testament to the futility of a search when the trail has been walked over by a killer who was patient enough to wait and then bold enough to stay. The farm itself was eventually razed, leaving only a small stone memorial in a quiet clearing, but the story of the stranger who moved into the house before he moved into the shadows remains a chilling reminder that some secrets are never meant to be uncovered. The silence of the Bavarian woods is heavy, but it is nothing compared to the howling, radioactive winds of the Ural Mountains. Our next story takes us to 1959, where 9 experienced hikers would meet an end so bizarre and terrifying that the official conclusion remains one of the most controversial mysteries in modern history. In late January of 1959, the Soviet Union was gripped by the kind of bone-chilling winter that feels as though it could stop time itself. For a group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, however, the freezing temperatures were not a deterrent, but a challenge. Led by the charismatic and highly capable Igor Dyatlov, these 9 experienced hikers were embarking on a difficult expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. Their goal was to reach the peak of Mount Otorten, a journey that required a level of skill and physical endurance that few possessed. To the rest of the world, they were just young, vibrant individuals with their whole lives ahead of them, singing songs on the train, sharing journals, and snapping black and white photographs of their progress. This was their illusion of normalcy, a high-stakes adventure fueled by camaraderie and the quiet, rhythmic crunch of skis on fresh powder. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the predator's mask began to reveal itself, though not in the form of a person. In this story, the predator was the mountain itself, specifically a peak known by the local Mansi people as Kholat Syakhl, or the Mountain of the Dead. On the surface, the landscape was a masterpiece of serene, untouched beauty. The mountains rose up like jagged white teeth against a pale blue sky, and the silence was so profound it felt holy. But beneath that mask of winter tranquility lay an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The weather was notoriously unpredictable, capable of shifting from a calm snowfall to a howling zero-visibility blizzard in a matter of minutes. The group had set up their final camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl on February 1st, 1959. They were just miles from their destination, and their journals from that night reflected a sense of accomplishment and lightheartedness. They ate a late dinner, joked about their surroundings, and prepared for a night of rest inside their sturdy, hand-sewn tent. But while they settled into their sleeping bags, the mask of the mountain was beginning to slip. The wind began to pick up, a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the canvas walls. They were experienced enough to know the dangers of the cold, but they had no way of knowing that something a compelling natural force was already closing in on their position, waiting for the split second when their guard was down to turn their sanctuary into a tomb. The silence inside the tent was broken not by a predator's growl, but by a sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere that turned their sanctuary into a trap. One moment, 9 experienced hikers were settling into their blankets, the fabric of their hand-sewn shelter snapping rhythmically in the biting mountain wind. The next, a primal, overwhelming terror gripped the group, a sensation so absolute that every rule of mountain survival they had ever mastered was instantly discarded. There was no time to unlace the heavy entrance of the tent, and no time to grab the thick felt boots or the heavy quilted jackets that meant the difference between life and death in the 1959 Soviet winter. The split second of the incident was a frantic, desperate struggle for an exit. Someone gripped by a panic we can only begin to imagine drew a knife and sliced through the canvas wall from the inside. The sound of tearing fabric was immediately swallowed by the roar of the freezing air as the 9 hikers spilled out into the darkness of the Ural Mountains. They weren't running toward a goal, they were fleeing from an unknown threat with such urgency that facing a minus 30-degree blizzard while severely underdressed seemed like the only option for survival. The initial chaos was a disjointed, silent scramble through the deep powder. There were no muffled screams that could be heard over the shrieking wind, only the rhythmic thud of hearts beating against ribs and the frantic gasps of lungs burning in the crystalline air. They left behind their shoes, their food, and their warmth, moving as a single, terrified unit down the slope toward the tree line, nearly a mile away. Behind them, the tent sat empty and torn on the side of the Mountain of the Dead, a lonely witness to a flight that defied everything these experienced hikers knew about staying alive in the wild. The predator on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl did not require a secret basement or a soundproofed room because the entire landscape of the Ural Mountains in 1959 provided those features naturally. To understand the dark side of this force, one has to look at the environment not as a backdrop, but as an active, calculating participant in the tragedy. The mountain, aptly named the Mountain of the Dead by the locals, possessed a psychology of absolute, cold indifference. It was a predator that had been waiting for eons, its preparation consisting of nothing more than the patient accumulation of snow and the steady, bone-chilling drop in temperature. The meticulous preparation of this invisible assailant was reflected in the bizarre state of the victims' remains. When the search parties finally reached the hikers, they discovered a scene that defied every law of predatory behavior known to man. Some of the victims had suffered severe internal trauma, including broken ribs and fractured skulls. Yet, there were absolutely no external wounds or bruises on the skin to indicate a physical struggle. It was as if an immense, invisible pressure had simply squeezed the life out of them from the inside. This suggests a dark side that operated with a clinical, almost laboratory-like precision, dismantling the human body without ever leaving a mark of its own. In this frozen theater, the soundproofing was provided by the howling rhythmic blizzard that masked the hikers' movements as they fled from their tent. Whatever force caused them to slash through the canvas from the inside and run into the darkness was so terrifying that it overruled the survival instinct to stay warm. The predator's mask was the whiteout condition of the storm, a veil of ice and wind that ensured no one would see or hear the struggle taking place on the mountainside. Furthermore, the secret basement of this mystery was found in the very fibers of the hikers' clothing. Upon forensic analysis, investigators were stunned to find that several pieces of their gear showed significant signs of radiation. This detail suggests a predator that wasn't just biological or atmospheric, but perhaps something far more advanced or experimental that had been lurking in the high altitudes of the Soviet wilderness. The most haunting aspect of this predator's psychology is the absolute silence it left behind. A silence so profound that the official conclusion of the authorities was simply a compelling natural force. This phrase serves as a grim admission that the predator they encountered was something they could neither name nor understand. A force that could remove a human tongue and leave a body radioactive in the middle of a mountain. Range. The silence that followed the group's departure into the wilderness of the Ural Mountains was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping realization that something had gone fundamentally wrong. Igor Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram to the Ural Polytechnic Institute's sports club from the village of Vizay no later than February 12, 1959. But as that date passed, and then the 13th, and then the 14th, the families and friends of the 9 hikers began to feel a cold, gnawing anxiety that mirrored the sub-zero temperatures of the Russian winter. The police deadlock and the subsequent military involvement began under a shroud of administrative hesitation. In the Soviet Union of 1959, the machinery of the state moved with a heavy, grinding deliberation. At first, officials dismissed the concerns, citing the group's high level of experience and the likelihood of simple weather delays. But by February 20th, the pressure from the hikers' families became a force that could no longer be ignored. The search efforts were launched, but they were hindered from the very first step by the sheer isolation and the psychological barrier of the terrain. The rescue parties, composed of students, teachers, and eventually the military, with planes and helicopters pushed into a landscape that seemed to actively resist their presence. For days, they flew over a monochromatic world of white and gray, searching for a single speck of color in a sea of snow. It wasn't until February 26th that a searcher spotted the corner of a tent poking through the drift on the eastern slope of Kholat-Syakhl. When the investigators reached the site, they were met with a scene that defied all logic and immediately plunged the investigation into a state of bewildered deadlock. The tent, the group's only sanctuary, had been sliced open from the inside with a knife. This minor detail was a psychological bombshell. It suggested that whatever had occurred was so sudden and so terrifying that the hikers believed their only chance at survival was to cut their way out of their own skin rather than use the door. The search efforts were further stymied by a series of confusing, near-invisible tracks. 8 or 9 sets of footprints, made by people wearing only socks or a single boot, or even walking completely barefoot, led away from the tent and down the slope toward the tree line. The professional searchers stood in the biting wind, looking at those prints, unable to fathom why 9 experienced hikers would flee into a -30-degree night, severely underdressed. The first 5 bodies were found over the next few days, frozen into the landscape like macabre statues. 2 were discovered under a large cedar tree near a small, spent fire, wearing only their underwear. 3 others, including Igor Dyatlov, were found scattered between the tree and the tent, as if they had been trying to crawl back to their supplies before the cold claimed them. But for the remaining 4 hikers, the search hit a literal and metaphorical wall. For months, the Soviet authorities were caught in a deadlock, unable to find the rest of the group despite intensive probing of the snow. This delay allowed the mystery to fester, fueled by the isolation of the site and the growing suspicion of the local Mansi people and the victims' families. It wasn't until the spring thaw in May that the final 4 were discovered buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine. The investigation remained hampered by the state's own culture of secrecy and corruption. Files were quickly classified, the area was cordoned off, and the community was met with a wall of silence from a government that seemed more interested in containing the narrative than uncovering the truth. The official conclusion of a compelling natural force became the ultimate deadlock, a vague, all-encompassing phrase that satisfied the paperwork but left the world with a haunting, radioactive void. The turning point in the Dyatlov Pass incident did not arrive with a sudden revelation in the days following the search party's arrival in February of 1959. Instead, it arrived months later, carried on the back of the spring thaw. For weeks, the Ural Mountains had held the final 4 members of the group in a frozen, white-knuckled grip, concealing them beneath layers of ice that no probe could penetrate. But in May of 1959, as the sun finally began to peel back the winter's coat, a random fluke of nature revealed a secret the mountain had tried to bury. A search party, moving through a deep ravine approximately 75 meters from the large cedar tree, noticed a scrap of gray fabric fluttering in the meltwater. As they dug through the remaining 4 meters of packed ice and slush, they uncovered a scene that displayed the incredible resilience of these young hikers, even as it deepened the horror of their final moments. They found the final 4 victims huddled together in a makeshift den they had carved into the snow. It was a desperate, tactical sanctuary. They had even taken the clothing from their friends who had already perished, cutting the fabric from their frozen limbs to wrap around their own feet and torsos in a final frantic bid to stay warm. But as the investigators began to examine the bodies, the tension reached a bone-chilling peak. These were not the bodies of people who had simply succumbed to the cold. The forensic team discovered that 3 of the hikers had suffered massive internal trauma. 1 had a fractured skull, and 2 others had major chest fractures, so severe they were comparable to the force of a high-speed car accident. And yet, in a detail that defies every law of physical combat, there were absolutely no external wounds, no bruising, and no soft tissue damage to match the shattered bones beneath. It was as if an immense, invisible hand had simply reached inside their chests and squeezed. Then came the flukes that would turn this case into a global mystery. As they examined one of the female hikers, they realized with a jolt of horror that she was missing her tongue. And when the investigators, acting on a strange hunch or a tip we still don't fully understand, brought a Geiger counter to the site, the silence of the ravine was broken by the frantic, rhythmic clicking of the device. The clothing of the hikers showed highly elevated levels of radiation. This discovery, the internal trauma without external marks, the missing tongue, and the radioactive fabric, shattered the theory of a simple mountain accident. The extreme tension of that discovery in the thawing ravine left the Soviet authorities in a state of shock, eventually leading them to close the case with the baffling and controversial conclusion that a compelling natural force had been the true predator on the mountain. The investigation into the 1959 tragedy was shuttered almost as quickly as it had begun. The Soviet authorities, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer lack of a human culprit, or pressured by the radioactive signatures found on the hikers' clothing, packed the files into gray cardboard boxes and moved them into the dust-choked corners of the archives. There would be no trial, no person to hold accountable, and no justice for the families of the 9 experienced hikers who had watched their vibrant children disappear into the whiteout of the mountains. The official conclusion that a compelling natural force was to blame served only to highlight the futility of the search for a conventional truth. The fate of the hikers remains etched into the history of the Ural Mountains, with the site now bearing the name Dyatlov Pass in their honor. Yet, the details of their the tent cut open from the inside, the flight into the snow while severely underdressed, and the horrific internal injuries like a missing tongue continue to baffle researchers decades later. The lesson learned is a haunting one. that there are forces in the wilderness that operate beyond human comprehension, leaving behind only radioactive remnants and the silence of the snow. The silence of the Ural Mountains is a cold, heavy thing. But our final story takes us to a place that is anything but silent. We are traveling to the humid, sweat-drenched streets of New Orleans in 1918, where a city was gripped by a predator who didn't just haunt the shadows, he demanded that the entire city play a specific kind of music just to stay alive. The year was 1918, and the city of New Orleans was a place where the air felt like a heavy, warm blanket, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant, rhythmic pulse of brass bands. Inside the narrow wooden homes of the Italian grocers who lived in the back of their shops, life followed a predictable, comforting pattern. Families would lock their front doors, extinguish the oil lamps, and drift into a deep sleep, listening to the hum of the cicadas and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled into the humid night. This was their illusion of normalcy, a belief that behind a locked door, their world was safe and private. But as the city moved into the early months of 1919, a predator began to move through these neighborhoods like a ghost made of shadow and steel. He didn't wear a mask of charm or intellect. His mask was the absolute anonymity of the night. The most terrifying aspect of his preparation was his lack of it. He often didn't even bring a weapon with him. Instead, he would methodically break into a home, move silently through the kitchen or the backyard woodpile, and find the family's own heavy, iron-headed axe. He turned the very tools of their survival into the instruments of their destruction, waiting for the split second when they were most vulnerable deep in the rhythmic, defenseless haze of sleep. The rhythmic pulse of New Orleans in 1918 was a tapestry of sound, the clanging of streetcars, the distant wail of a trumpet, and the constant, low hum of the Mississippi River. But in the deep, velvet hours of the early morning, that tapestry would unravel into a terrifying silence. Inside the modest homes of the city's working class, families slept with a trust that seems foreign to us now. Their heavy wooden doors locked against the humidity, but not against the monster that had begun to stalk their dreams. The split second of the crime never began with a shattered window or a kicked-in door. Instead, it began with a sound so subtle it was often mistaken for the house settling in the heat, the low, rhythmic rasp of a chisel against wood. The predator would meticulously carve out a panel from the back door, reaching through the opening with a steady hand to slide the bolt. He moved with a terrifying, practiced grace, slipping into the kitchens and hallways like a shadow, detaching itself from the wall. Once inside, he didn't search for gold or jewelry. He searched for the heavy, iron-headed tool that every household in the city possessed the family's own axe. There is a visceral, bone-chilling horror in the realization that the very instrument used to provide warmth and fuel for the home was the weapon used to destroy it. He would stand at the foot of the bed, the moonlight catching the dull sheen of the blade, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his victims' chests as they remained trapped in the innocence of sleep. The initial chaos was not a scream that woke the neighborhood. It was a muffled, wet thud that barely disturbed the person in the next room. In 1918, the layout of these New Orleans homes, often referred to as shotgun houses, meant that rooms were lined up one after another. A struggle in the bedroom would be heard as nothing more than a heavy object falling to the floor. It wasn't until the morning sun began to bleed through the shutters, illuminating the dark, iron-scented pools on the floorboards, that the true horror would be discovered. Neighbors would gather on the sidewalks, their faces pale with a sudden, sharp fear, whispering about the axeman who had vanished into the humid air long before the first bell of the morning. The city was no longer just a place of music and celebration. It had become a hunting ground where every shadow held the weight of a heavy iron blade. The dark side of the predator who haunted the Crescent City between 1918 and 1919 was not defined by the weapons he carried, but by the ones he chose to find. To understand the psychology of the axeman, you have to look at the terrifying, intimate nature of his preparation. He was not a common thief looking for silver or coin. He was an intruder of the most personal degree. His meticulous method involved breaking into the homes of unsuspecting families while they were at their most vulnerable, surrounded by the rhythmic breathing of their loved ones in the dead of night. The secret basement of his operation was the very architecture of New Orleans itself. He navigated the narrow alleys and the shadow-drenched backyards of the city with a chilling familiarity. But the most unsettling detail of his dark psychology was his choice of armament. He did not bring a gun or a knife from the outside world. Instead, he would enter a home and seek out the family's own axe. There is a profound, twisted logic in this. using a tool that the victim had held in their own hands, a tool used to build their home and warm their hearth, to dismantle their lives. This was a predator who found power in the subversion of domestic safety. His preparation extended into the psychological realm, turning the entire city into a theater for his dark whims. The most famous display of this mask was a letter he allegedly sent to the press. In it, he claimed to be a demon from the hottest hell, but he offered a bizarre, rhythmic mercy. He stated that he would not kill anyone in a home where jazz music was playing on the night he was out. This wasn't just a letter, it was a tactical move to soundproof his own legend with the cacophony of a city's fear. He wanted to hear the music of his own influence echoing through every street and every shotgun house in New Orleans, forcing 100,000 people to perform for him just to see another sunrise. The hallways of the New Orleans police precincts in 1918 were thick with more than just the swampy, stifling heat. They were heavy with a growing, rhythmic sense of defeat. Detectives sat at their oak desks, shirt sleeves rolled up and soaked with sweat, staring at maps of the city that were becoming increasingly cluttered with red ink. Each mark represented a home where the sanctuary of sleep had been violated, yet the trail remained as cold as a stone at the bottom of the Mississippi River. The search efforts were failing not for a lack of grit, but because the predator was a ghost who used the victims' own lives against them. Every time an investigator arrived at a new scene, they were met with the same mocking deadlock. The killer had used the family's own axe to commit the deed. In an era before advanced forensics or digital databases, there were no ballistics to track and no unique blades to identify. Because the weapon was already in the house before the killer ever arrived, there was no trail of a purchased weapon or a hidden stash. The police were looking for a man with a weapon, but the man they were hunting walked the streets with empty hands, knowing his tools were waiting for him behind the locked doors of his victims. Furthermore, a profound social and psychological barrier had settled over the city like a thick, damp fog. A significant number of the victims belonged to the Italian immigrant community, hardworking grocers who often lived in tight-knit, isolated pockets of the city. Language barriers and a deep-seated distrust of a police force that was often perceived as indifferent or even corrupt led to a wall of community silence. Neighbors were paralyzed by a dual fear. They were terrified of the Axeman's blade, but they were also hesitant to bring the authorities into their private lives. This deadlock was a suffocating reality for the city. The police were left to chase whispers in the dark, while the predator continued to move through the narrow, humid streets of 1918 and 1919 New Orleans with almost total impunity. He was a shadow that left no footprint, a whisper that left no echo, leaving an entire city to wonder if the law was simply a thin, paper and ink shield against a monster made of iron and spite. On the morning of March 13, 1919, the office of a local New Orleans newspaper was thick with the smell of heavy ink and the low, rhythmic clatter of manual typewriters. A letter had arrived, and as the staff gathered around to read the jagged, arrogant script, the air in the room seemed to turn ice cold despite the stifling Louisiana heat. The author claimed to be an invisible spirit, a demon from the hottest hell, and he announced with a terrifying level of certainty that he would be stalking the streets once again on the following Tuesday night. This was the turning point that the city had been dreading, a direct, mocking communication from the predator who had been turning their homes into slaughterhouses with their own tools. The extreme tension of the city shifted from a quiet, internal dread to a frantic, public panic. But the letter offered a strange, almost rhythmic mercy. The Axeman promised he would never strike a home where the sound of jazz music was playing. It was a random fluke of a demand, a psychological game played by a killer who wanted to hear the entire city perform for him. This wasn't a case that would be solved by a digital photo or a strand of DNA. Instead, the resilience of the community was tested by their ability to keep the music going through the darkest hours of the night. On the night specified in the letter, New Orleans became the loudest city on Earth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the French Quarter, the first notes of trumpets and trombones began to wail. It was a scene of absolute, rhythmic chaos. In the grandest mansions of Street, Charles Avenue, and the humblest shotgun houses of the back streets, every window was thrown open and every phonograph was cranked to its limit. Professional bands played in crowded dance halls until their fingers were raw, and families who couldn't afford an instrument banged on pots and pans or sang at the top of their lungs. The atmosphere was one of desperate celebration, a community-wide exorcism performed with brass and rhythm. People who had spent months locking their doors and staring into the shadows now stood on their porches, bathed in light and sound, daring the monster to step out of the darkness. The predator had demanded a tribute, and New Orleans gave it to him in a frantic, exhausting flood of music that didn't stop until the first light of the following morning. When the sun finally rose, the city breathed a collective, ragged sigh of relief. No one had been attacked. The demon had kept his word, or perhaps he had simply been drowned out by the sheer, vibrant will of a city that chose to play jazz rather than die in silence. The music of that frantic March night eventually faded into the humid morning air, but the silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of a victim, but the wary, exhausted quiet of a city that had looked into the abyss and decided to play a trumpet at it. The Axeman had demanded a tribute, and in receiving it, he had effectively turned an entire population into his reluctant orchestra. The fate of the predator remains one of the most haunting voids in the history of American crime. After a final, brutal attack in October of 1919, the killings simply stopped. There was no grand police raid, no dramatic shootout on the levee, and no satisfying unmasking in a courtroom. The Axeman didn't leave behind a body or a confession. He simply dissolved back into the heavy New Orleans fog, leaving a trail of empty homes and blood-stained axes in his wake. Justice was never served in the traditional sense. While suspects were named, most notably a man named Joseph Momfrey, who was later shot in Los Angeles by the widow of one of the Axeman's victims, nothing was ever proven. The legal system was left in a state of permanent deadlock, unable to reconcile the image of a demon from hell with the reality of a flesh-and-blood killer who knew how to use a chisel and a stolen tool. The lesson learned by the city was one of profound vulnerability, the realization that even your own home and your own tools can be turned against you if the predator is patient enough to wait for the rhythm of your breath to slow. The legacy of the Axeman lives on in the very jazz music he claimed to love. He became a folk monster, a boogeyman of the bayou, whose mask was the anonymity of the crowd and the shadows of the shotgun houses. He proved that sometimes the only way to survive a monster is to refuse to be silent, to fill the air with so much life and sound that the darkness has nowhere left to hide. We have traveled through the meticulously planned basements of a charismatic law student, the silent attic of a Bavarian farm, the radioactive frost of the Ural Mountains, and the jazz-soaked streets of New Orleans. Across these 5 stories, one truth remains constant. The most terrifying predators aren't the ones who look like monsters. They are the ones who wear the mask of the ordinary, the ones who look like a helpful stranger, a quiet roommate, or a compelling natural force. They remind us that normalcy is often just a thin veil, and that the true measure of a community isn't found in its safety, but in how it responds when that veil is finally torn away. And now, we let the shadows go. The stories have reached their end, and their voices are fading into the distance, leaving only the quiet of the present moment. Take a deep, slow breath in through your nose, hold it for just a second, and let it out with a long, soft sigh. You are safe. You are in your own space, your own bed, wrapped in the warmth and comfort of your home. The doors are locked, the world outside is still, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. Feel your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw relax, and feel the tiny muscles around your eyes soften. Notice how heavy your limbs are becoming, as if gravity is gently pulling you deeper into the mattress. Your legs feel heavy. Your arms feel heavy. Your head is perfectly supported. You are sinking into the bed, and the bed is rising up to hold you. Imagine the dark streets and the cold mountain winds are dissolving like smoke. In their place, a soft, silver mist is rolling in. You are standing at the edge of an ancient forest, a place of absolute, timeless peace. The ground beneath you is a thick, plush carpet of cool moss that cushions every step. The air is fresh, smelling of pine needles and fallen rain. There is no sound here but the faint, rhythmic whisper of the wind through the high canopy. The trees are tall and protective, standing like silent guardians around your sleep. As you walk deeper into this mist, every worry and every thought simply drifts away. You are moving toward a place of perfect stillness. Inhale the cool, clean air. Exhale the last of the day. You are warm. You are protected. You are exactly where you need to be. The night is long, the forest is quiet, and your dreams are waiting for you in the soft, white light. Sleep now, sweet dreams, and have a beautiful, restful night.